Again. Greg, I guess you knew I was going to ask you to lead that. Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Matthew 22:6. Second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. We just sang the best lesson that we could ever have. The two greatest commandments. So fitting that we think about that as we begin any lesson, reminding ourselves of just about that foundation that's built on the love of God and the love that we share with one another, based upon everything that's written within the Scriptures. If you read with us a while ago from Luke chapter 5, I invite you to turn back to that section. We're going to start there with the lesson. Being called, I guess you might title the lesson this morning. We're starting a new year, just around the corner. We remarked in our Bible class this morning here how those that are in my age bracket and getting on up there and maybe in a few more years are looking at this time right now, and they're looking at the calendar and they're looking at their papers and they're going, it's ended already, 2012. I barely remember to write that on my checks or my notes or whatever. Kids, on the other hand, are enthusiastic and they're excited about this and all. And they're just lunging forward, and us older ones are putting on the brakes. Well, what do you do with the new year? We start over. We start over. And as you think about a new year, most of us usually stop and reflect upon what we wished we'd done last year and didn't do well enough. And we make a resolution. An affirmation about something we'd like to do better. Starting over, a new life, a new thing. And I'm going to lead toward this over the next several weeks as we think about this year and what we hope to do as Christians. What we plan to do as a church. What we might do to strengthen ourselves. It's so good to have such a mix of people in this congregation. There's the vitality of the brand new babies that are in here. And giving out a New Testament to a brand new baby. It's so exciting because it tells us there's life here. We have the maturity on the other side here too. To remind us there's stability, there are anchors. And mixed in between is all that we have here. And this is Christianity as it is. And as we begin to think about this being called, it has a lot to do with starting over. And that's what was happening really in Luke chapter 5. Now, the Gospel of Mark in chapter 4, or Mark chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 4 also talk about this Jesus calling his disciples and beginning with these 4 fishermen. But Luke gives us a little bit more of a detail about what's going on here. What's interesting in verse 4 here, as we were talking about this or reading from it a while ago, is that Jesus walks up and asks Simon Peter now, to launch out into the deep and to let down his nets. And then Simon's answer back there, but Master, we have toiled all night and we've caught nothing. So they've been out there, and Jesus knows they've been out there. Perhaps they had just gotten up to the shore as he's walking up there. And so Jesus comes along and takes advantage of the opportunity of the nets and everything there. And he says, let's go back out and talk for a while and begin to speak. And then he says, now let's go out into the deep. Now, reminds you that this is a carpenter giving a suggestion to a fisherman of how to go back and fish the right way. But he's testing their faith to start with, and I want you to notice that. And Peter gave the right response. We've already done all this all night long, but because you say so, we'll go do it again. There's the essence of what God is asking for in our lives when we think about being a disciple. Lord, we're going to do it all that we can, but sometimes we just don't have it together. Even the professionals can't handle the professional things in their own nature perfectly. But we're going to listen to what God says in every way. And even when it goes against everything that we think would be the right way. If it's God saying it, we're going to trust Him and we're going to go back and we're going to do it the right way. And so there's that issue of faith. And the result that comes out of that was amazing. And when they had done this, verse 6, they went out and they caught a great number of fish. And as you read along that, they had to signal their partners, come over here. And then they started loading the boats down, and it says in the latter part of verse 7 that they began to sink. What a catch! Well, this is something to brag about. They get it back to the shore, and then they walked off and left it all. When Jesus called them, He's calling them to tell them not that you're just following me, and that's the issue of it all. That's what the discipleship concept means, to be a follower and a learner of Jesus. But He's going to be setting them apart for a special service. They're called to be different than the rest of the world now. I want you to stop and think about that for just a moment. Many of you in here have made a commitment to Christ. You've been immersed in baptism into Christ. You've made a commitment to Him. And you've been going along and studying God's Word, perhaps attending Bible class quite regularly, and studying at home, and praying, involved in services, doing many different things. Now think back to these 4 guys here that Jesus calls. Because they were doing much of the same thing before He called them to be a disciple. They were God-fearing Jews. They've been going to the temple. They've been praying. They've been giving. They've been doing all kinds of things. Perhaps even more than what you're doing. And when Jesus comes along, He says, now I'm going to call you and set you apart for something special. As if it's just now starting. Now think about that for a moment. Because we thought we'd started a long time ago at our commitment to Christ in baptism. And they thought they had started theirs a long time ago when they went through whatever ritual they did in becoming an adult and being a strong Jew and being involved in that. And they were doing things, and yet that was just the background to it all. Now I'm going to set you apart for something special. And so when we look at this call, number one, it is a call to a commitment to Jesus. They walked away from their nets, the greatest catch of fish they'd ever had, the bragging rights and all that might come along with all that, and they just left it behind. Now I'm going to be focused on you. And when it comes down to Jesus, He's not first place, He's only place. Now, mind you, it is first place. But there is no second place. Sometimes we think about Jesus has first and then I have. But the way Jesus is looking at this, there's no second place out there. It's all focused on me. A little later in Luke chapter 9, Jesus will say, if anyone desires to come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. Now that phrase here about taking up his cross, Jesus knew very well what it was about. He had just got through telling, matter of fact, his apostles that He was going to be going to Jerusalem and dying. And then after that He says, and if anyone wants to come after me, then let him deny himself and take up his cross. And then a little later in that very same book, Luke will write that Jesus said, with the words of Jesus, now, no man putting his hands to the plow and looking back is worthy of the kingdom. Meaning, if you're going to come up to Jesus and say, I'm ready to follow you, then forget about what's behind you. Don't even think about looking back. If you're still focused in another direction, you're thinking the wrong way. I only have one direction, and it's following me. It was a total commitment to Jesus Christ. This discipleship following Jesus. Now think about that for the new year. I know that many of you either have been or will be thinking about what you want to do for this year in a variety of ways. Exercise, weight, all these things. And spiritually too. Focusing on Jesus. Committing the year to Jesus. In a way that you've never done before. It was a call also for these apostles with a purpose. Leave the nets, leave the fish, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Or as Luke renders it, you will catch men. There was a purpose in what they were going to be doing. Now they already knew that fishing business, it wasn't like what we see today. And of course, I'm relicking it more to the hobby. I guess the men that are really out there on the fishing lines and doing it for a business understand very well the hard work, the perseverance, the patience, endurance, and all of that's wrapped up in that concept of really being fishermen. And so when I think Jesus is asking them for this commitment, second to that nature, just for their understanding of what being a fisherman was involved, meant now you're going to be coming in and working hard with me. And there's patience involved in that, endurance involved in that. It's a lifetime of being what you need to be. And when you get through being fishermen, you smell like fish. When you get through being a disciple of Jesus, people are going to say, wow, that person's been with Jesus. I can just tell. Like you can tell being around a fisherman. It was a call for diligence. Now, turn over to 1 Peter. As we're looking at what Peter says later in his life about this whole thing. The change that takes place. Chapter 2. He talks about growth in the Word in verses 1 through 3. And then beginning at verse 4, Peter writes these words. And I wonder if he's still thinking about his call to his purpose and his commitment. And he says, coming to him as to a living stone, that is, we're coming to Jesus, our living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also, as living stones. So Jesus is the living stone, and we also are involved in that. And are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Christ Jesus. Wow. What a purpose involved in this. All the things that we might assign to Old Testament concepts of growth and nurturing and all now, spiritual house and sacrifices, Peter's relating that to Christianity. Now when I think of what's going on in the Old Testament worship, and they had their elements and their sacrifices and all these different pieces within the temple, those were special tools that were used only in the temple. They were called sanctified, set apart, in other words. They were instruments that were to be used only during worship to God. Now, as Peter's relating these things about the temple to us as Christians, I see the connection here. As if to say, your life is not ordinary anymore. It's to be set apart and used only for special purposes. Holy and sanctified. Not mixed up in the world. Not confused with the entanglements of everything out there that leads you away from God. But rather now, continually focused toward Jesus Christ. Down in verse 9, again, he will say, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. And as he describes that, he says, here's your purpose. That you may proclaim the praises of him who has called you out of darkness. Man, called out of darkness and into his marvelous light. We have a special nature that's given to us. We are set apart for a special purpose. We are called out of that old life. Afterwards, Peter will describe in these verses here things that help us in the stepping stones to understand what's being involved in this. In verse 11, he says, therefore, beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims. Remember now, you're not tied with this world. You're just like anybody else that was wandering in the wilderness back in the Old Testament times. You're pilgrims or sojourners. Number 1, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul. We get so mixed up in this life with the things we see. We get so swept up in wanting and having and possessing, and all that does is really work against our spiritual nature. Abstain from those things. Abstain from everything that's happening out there. Because all it does is just pull you more into Satan's realm and lead you eventually away from God. Abstain, part number 1, from all of these things, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. Therefore submit yourselves, part 2, to every ordinance of man, for name's sake, whether to the king supreme, and then he goes on and talks about, or to governors, or to those who are sent by him, as punishment for evildoers. So there's a submission process, even in the life that we live here on earth, submitting to rulers, abstaining on one side from the things that take you that way, and then submitting to regulations and ordinances that this seems so petty because they're earthly. But when we're getting along with those, what it does is it says to the rest of the world while we're doing this, we're good. We're going to be following God in every way and following the petty little regulations that you might have. We're going to do it all in submission to God. And then he goes on and he adds to that. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Reputation. They might say some things about us as Christians, but when we have a clean reputation, it cries out louder in the reverse of what they've said. And in the end, God is glorified, and their words are put to silence. And they're convinced, at least, even if they don't believe what we do, that we believe what we're talking about enough to the point that we follow it. That we don't just talk about it, but we live it. And we live it to the very end. And that says a whole lot to the people out there, as opposed to different things that are going on in the religious world where people say one thing and do something different. There's a consistency about what we say and what we do. It's the will of God. And then verse 17, he says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. It wraps up everything that we're about as Christians. Honoring all people. Being respectable. Treating people as Jesus would have done. Love the brotherhood. That we continue to do what we need to do for one another. The world beats up on us enough as it is out there. There needs to be a refuge that people come to. That when they come to Central, or when they come into our homes, and they're involved in our lives, that there's this protection, this refuge, that we are loved here. We're family here. You might get beat up out there, but come here. Because the love of God in the greatest commands and loving one another, talked about in those 2 lessons, it tells each other that we care for one another. And that we're enduring together. And that we will make it to heaven together. Fearing God. Fear God and keep His commandments, Ecclesiastes tells us. It's the whole duty of man, or the whole of man, basically, Ecclesiastes 13. Chapter 12, verse 13. Following Jesus. As we think about this new year, it's just the starting point. We're getting on a path, and we are not too sure where it's going to lead us. I think about those disciples when they first started following Jesus. The Gospel of John tells us the first miracle that Jesus did, changing water into wine at a wedding feast. And then they left right after that. And John says, and they went in to town, into Jerusalem. And they walked into the temple. Now think about these apostles here, because they have just decided they're going to follow Jesus.